Hey everyone, welcome back to another Hellfire Gala update video. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at Colossus's upgrade and uniform, and briefly look how he does in PvE compared to his old uniform, which surprisingly isn't that great, but also, more importantly, in PvP. You might have already heard that his upgrade or rework, I guess, doesn't really do much for him, and sadly that is kind of the case. It is a very niche upgrade for very specific kind of uses, but you'll see in the video why that is exactly. Just to preface the video, in case you don't have a lot of time, I wouldn't really recommend picking up this one to the majority of the community. This is mostly for people that want to get some extra value out of the character in Timeline or Alliance Conquest, but even then, it's very marginal. As always, these are the card stats that I'm testing with, so just keep that in mind when you see the performance of the character. So right off the bat, I'm taking him right into the World Boss Ultimate tests and World Boss Legend to see how the character does with the new uniform. The build that I did all my testing with in PvE is a CTP of Insight, though if you want to use the character for some reason in PvE, which I wouldn't really recommend because he's not really that good, you would probably want to go with a CTP of Rage, and I'm pretty sure that you can also make a CTP of Destruction or Energy Work, i.e. a single skill damage proc CTP. But more than likely the Rage will be your best option, since he can't really layer skills on top of one another, and you can't really cancel skills into one another. If you're wondering why I laughed when I said you can build him for PvE, it's because during my testing I found out that his uniform barely improved him. I finished stage 99 of Proxima with 1 minute and 30 seconds remaining roughly, and with a lot of the other characters' uniforms that they've gotten previously or with other patches, I've finished with 2, 3, or 4 minutes remaining for most of them. One nice thing that they did do with the uniform, however, is they added a bunch of CC effects, so if you're fighting World Boss Ultimate bosses that are affected by CC effects, so not Thanos, then you can basically keep spamming your 1 and 3rd skill, which both have about 3 seconds of paralysis that ignores immunity on it, and essentially completely lock down the opponent. The all defense down that ignores immunity is still sadly capped out at 30%, which kind of limits his performance in stages outside Thanos, since he can't complete them fairly quickly and heavily relies on that awakening skill, which has the 70% all defense down. The rotation that I used, which I would assume is the rotation that you would use if you have something like a CTP of Rage or a multi-skill damage proc, is you use the 5th skill first to get the damage accumulation for damage dealt, then you go into your 4th skill and let that play out till the end, and then go into your 3rd skill and let that play out to the end, and then you can basically try to spam the 2nd and 1st skill in between while you wait for the skills to come back off cooldown. If you're using a single skill damage proc, the rotation would then be 5 cancel, so you get that damage accumulation, and then just proc on your 4th skill, and make sure you don't cancel it, because that final roar is where the majority of the damage is located on the skill. Once you have your awakening skill unlocked, the rotation is exactly the same, except that you incorporate the 6th skill first and immediately cancel it into the rotations that I previously mentioned. So that would be 6 cancel 5 into 4 and then 3, or 6 cancel, 5 cancel, 4. You can see what I meant about his PvE potential, since I've tested many characters without a damage proc versus stage 60 of Thanos, and I was barely able to complete it with Colossus, finishing with just 11 seconds left. One of the things that the devs did get right about the character, however, is the stat bump. He gets a massive, almost doubling of his HP, and a pretty sizable increase to his physical attack as well. This means that if you want to use the character as a solo or dedicated PvP character, you can equip him with the CTP of Regen, since the HP pool will synergize very well with that Regen shield. In fact, even if you don't have his artifact that heals him, I would probably recommend using a CTP of Regen over the other options, because his healing is very kind of not good and all over the place. So the little bit of healing that you get from the regen is actually very helpful. You can also use a CTP of Authority since it doesn't clash with his accumulation, and if you get the steal effect, the mitigation will be pretty crazy versus physical types and will help, I guess, a little bit against blast types. Also, when I mentioned the healing is inconsistent, I'm referring to the artifact, since he obviously doesn't have healing in his kit, which is one major screw up, I would say, by the devs, since that should be an essential part of his kit. But other than the CTPs that I listed, he absolutely needs guard break immunity, I found. Otherwise, he doesn't really perform well as a solo character, especially when I tested him with the CTP of Insight. He's basically constantly getting guard broken and can hardly do anything. Anyways, with the Awakening skill unlocked, you can see just how much of a difference it makes now that he has that 70% all defense down every so often, since he's able to take down stage 99 of Proxima almost 2 minutes faster than before. And then versus Thanos, you see an identical result. He's able to take him down 2 minutes faster, which also suggests that a majority of the damage in his kit is associated with his Awakening skill. And this will become very clear if you take him into timeline and you see just how long he dukes it out with the opponent and usually needs the Awakening skill to finish them off, especially if they are not a physical type that succumbs to his reflect damage. Here in this test, I take on stage 10 of Knull, and surprisingly I am able to finish the fight with 34 seconds remaining, but that is not really a great finish time by any means, especially considering that I'm using a really high damage leadership, a support, and have 22% pierce on my cards. If you're wondering where he was with the previous uniform, I get to the midway mark of the Knull fight with about 3 minutes and 15 seconds remaining, and with the new uniform I get to that same point roughly 30 seconds faster. So you can see that his new base kit with the uniform is definitely a pretty decent upgrade, but the fact that it takes so long for him to finish still shows just how much he still needs to improve. By the way, if you're wondering why I'm even bothering to show the PvE content, it's to give you an idea of his base damage and to show that he's not really great in PvE, and his performance in PvP isn't that much better with the new uniform. It's kind of a niche upgrade, which begs the question, why bother getting the uniform at all? The answer to that, I guess, is that he's more reliable in being able to solo characters now, and you can potentially run him as a solo character in timeline. Though you wouldn't obviously build your team around the character, since he doesn't have many of the go-to skills that are required for high-level PvP competition. So that would primarily be iframe ignores and a consistent heal, I would say. He obviously does have a reflect, which is pretty good, especially versus physical types that seem to be popping up more and more in the timeline meta. But one unfortunate other thing that I've noticed about his new kit is that he seems to stay out of iframe a lot, which is fine for reflecting damage, but you absolutely need a consistent heal in order to not have long iframes or frequent iframes, because then you're going to take so much damage you can't heal it back up and your reflect is going to be pointless. And herein is where the big problem lies with his rework, that the artifact is where he gets his healing from as opposed to his base kit. They should have put a passive heal into his kit somewhere, or if they didn't want to do that, then they could have just made it so certain skills heal him. Having his artifact be the only means for healing him and basing the heal off of a % chance of being hit and having such a low heal value just makes the character almost non-usable in most content. If you noticed in the first two clips, I actually didn't have the artifact equipped because I wanted to see how he would perform without a heal. With his new uniform, he is pretty consistent as a solo character, but you absolutely do need the artifact if you're fighting stronger opponents such as Doom, which has a lot of iframes, or characters that heal a lot like Gilgamesh or possibly Wolverine. In many ways, the character serves a similar function to Ebony Maw, in which if you build him with a CTP of Insight, he will definitely act like a really great support for the team. But if you build him for a solo purpose, such as with a CTP of Regen or Authority, he can definitely have the potential to take out very strong opponents on the enemy team and potentially save you from a loss. This test that you're seeing here is a very specific one, which highlights the niche kind of improvement that he gets with the uniform. Specifically, that he is much better versus physical types because of that 30 to 40% mitigation that he gets versus physical types added to his uniform. But most of the times, these characters that you're facing are fairly tanky and have a lot of healing. So this is why I said that you definitely need that artifact, otherwise you're just going to whittle down to 0 health and die that way. You'll also notice from before that I mentioned that his base damage isn't the best, and you can see that particularly in this fight, where the only ways that he really takes out the opponent is either through the reliance of his reflect damage or through the use of his 6th skill or awakening skill. Generally speaking, his 1 through 5 skills aren't going to net you a kill, but simply act to increase the damage of the reflect or the 6th skill. One of the other downsides when getting the uniform is that if you really do want to make the character work as a solo character, besides getting the artifact, it's highly recommended again to use something like a CTP of Regen or Authority to get that guard break immunity and give him those other little extra things, especially if you reforge and get the penetration or steal effects on those CTPs. But in addition to that, you also need a lot of HP Urus and possibly even HP Odins, if you can spare them, added to his kit in order for him to live as long as possible for the artifact to proc and give you the heal. Basically, what I'm saying is that the uniform is very niche. It's used to counter physical types, and the performance won't be that much kind of better versus non-physical types. Besides that, you also need to essentially go full out on the character if you get the uniform and want them to perform with it, because if you just go with something like a CTP of Insight, don't really have that many Urus, or kind of enhance his type enhancement so that you're better versus the speed types, then his performance will be lackluster and the uniform will be even more kind of pointless to get. You could have gotten the same performance by simply just using the older uniform. You can obviously see from the background clip that in timeline, when you're facing opponents one-on-one and those opponents are physical types, he is obviously very consistent and a good counter versus them, especially if they don't have something like a CTP of Greed. Otherwise, you're kind of out of luck. I also wanted to note that I am using Colossus's own lead, so he won't necessarily be as consistent as you're seeing here, because that physical immunity leadership is actually adding a lot versus these characters. But you can definitely do that in Alliance Conquest. However, my point is that in a 3 vs 3 setting, there is going to be a lot of mixed damage, and because his uniform specifically gives him physical damage mitigation, you won't really notice these benefits as much in Alliance Conquest as you would in Timeline, where it's a 1 vs 1 setting. You can see exactly what I mean in a few seconds here when I show the Alliance Conquest testing, but if the character was given something like an iframe or a passive heal or even healing on certain skills, he would be much better than the state that they released him in. And with those kinds of improvements, then I would be less reluctant to tell you to kind of avoid the uniform, and probably would actually advise you to get it. But that's obviously not the case. So here in the Alliance Conquest part of the testing, you can see that I still used his leadership similar to how I did in Timeline, because that ended up being the best use of the character for testing his solo capability. It was usually just using his leadership and another strong character that would kind of cover his weaknesses, which would be high damage, or rather a lack of high damage. I did try to use him as a pure solo with just 2 other supports, but most of the time it didn't really work that great, and he would just usually end up dying. But regardless how you use him, you do have the capability now of using him similar to Luke Cage, with some of the other characters that have a weakness to combat types. or possibly speed types. You probably might notice some of these clips from the Psylocke video that I posted the day before, since it was easy to couple the two characters together to test both of them at the same time. So a better example of that is that you can use Colossus to protect Spider-Man versus his combat weakness, and funny enough, in this team that I fought, I was actually expecting Spider-Man to die first and Colossus to be the last one standing to win the fight. However, one thing that I noticed with Colossus is that he is very susceptible himself to reflect, so ironically enough, even though he's good versus combat types, a lot of them do have reflect, which he ends up being bad against. So that's characters like Shang-Chi, Black Dwarf, Luke Cage, and even another opponent, Colossus. Suffice to say, if you get lucky, you are capable of soloing a full defenders team, but it's likely going to take almost the full duration of the first round. And even then, at any point, you could potentially die to reflect damage from Luke Cage, or if you enter your awakening skill first, you might actually die to reflect damage that way. In a lot of ways, it's better if the opponent goes into their awakening skill, since Colossus can reflect all of that damage back and win that way. This is another problem with the uniform. The lack of damage on skills 1 through 5 means that you might end up going to the end of the timer, and then you'll probably lose because he doesn't have the healing that other opponents have. The best example of this is versus an opponent, Gilgamesh. I slowed down the last portion of this clip to highlight exactly what I'm talking about. Colossus has his awakening skill available and immediately goes into it and ends up dying from reflect damage to Luke Cage. Another issue with the uniform in a way is that he doesn't have self-debuff removal of any kind, and I'm not talking about the passives, but a bunch of characters recently have had their 1 through 5 skills have some effect in it that allows them to remove harmful CC effects from themselves. Colossus doesn't have this, and if you don't run debuff removal on him versus some of the characters that do have this for themselves, he'll basically just end up getting CC locked or stun locked or whatever have you and end up dying that way. Which is what happens in this clip versus the Luke Cage that has it with his debuff leadership. So this all ties back to what I said in the beginning, that the character mostly serves a niche purpose, and even in Alliance Conquest, you won't really see the gains that you'd hope to see. The majority of players are likely not going to use him as a solo character in Timeline, so for the majority of players, the new uniform likely won't serve much of a purpose. The other thing to keep in mind is that my Colossus is fully built up, and I believe he is at around rank 7. I'm assuming that most other players don't have resources like this to throw on a character to make them viable, let alone make them really good. So that again is another reason why I wouldn't really recommend the uniform for most players. I'm hoping that the devs realize this and at the very least add some kind of heals to his skills if they don't want to tinker with the artifact in any way. That would really up his playability, since he can at least get heals from the skills that he uses, if not for his passive heal that is non-existent. Anyways, that does it for this video. If you liked the video, please consider liking, subscribing, and possibly sharing. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section and I'll get back to them as soon as I can. But that pretty much wraps it up for this one. The next one is going to be for Mr. Sinister, so thanks for your time, but the video is now over.